Whereas under the Bermuda, you have to prove deep and emotional psychological harm in order to meet the first element of hate speech. Under this bill, any emotional, psychological, physical, social, cultural, or economic harm goes. So what's any emotional harm?
What is the importance of freedom of religion for a democratic society? Well, joining me on the show are Daniela Ellerbeck and Michael Swain. They are from the organization 4SA, which promotes religious freedom in South Africa. Daniela Ellerbeck, Michael Swain, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be on board and really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for having us, David.
All right. Well, Michael, let's start with you. This idea of religious freedom, something that maybe we take for granted, that people on a Friday or a Sunday might go off to their place of worship to pay respect to their God. But it wasn't always the case that people had the ability to freely practice their religion. Why is this an important right in a modern liberal democracy such as ours?
Already nothing has changed over all of the millennia. Human beings are very much spiritual beings, and spirituality is inherent and integral to our humanity. It is one of the things that gives us dignity. It's one of the things that defines the purpose of our lives. And obviously, its transference even to our children is very important to us as parents. It really fundamentally, whether you frankly believe it or you don't believe in anything, it will nevertheless shape how you live your life. It reflects in our relationship. It reflects in the societies and in the institutions which govern us. And again, I think that's probably the reason why in many countries now, religious freedom is considered to be an inalienable right, rather than one that is simply granted at the whim of some political dispensation. And it's probably very important because, as you correctly said, we do tend to take it for granted that we can express and live out our faith, and as if it's always been that way, but it actually has not. History records, particularly in the European context, the incredibly high price that has been paid for this right to be established. You might remember there was over 200 years of literal bloody warfare in Europe as a result of the sort of Protestant-Catholic conflict. And again, as soon as, and I think this has been a very important component of religious freedom, as soon as you see some institution of state, some power of the state backing any faith or any ideology, the consequence of that is normally very terrible for people who are perhaps caught on the other side. And again, that has been seen in the conflicts that have taken place over years, over hundreds of years, at the cost of oceans of human blood. And thankfully, again, really in this past century, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was formulated, Article 18 states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And that includes, of course, the right to change your religion or belief, or freedom to practice it either alone or in community with others, in private or in public, and to manifest that in teaching and practice and worship and observance. And that is, I think, basically why freedom of religion is so important. It's been hard won, and we cannot, I believe, afford to take it for granted. If we take our human rights for granted, very often we lose them. And once we lose them, they're extremely hard to regain.
Yeah, and I think what's quite striking about South Africa, that for all of our problems, and there are many, religious sectarian conflict doesn't seem to feature very highly. At least that's my perception. We have all sorts of other social cleavages and tensions, but thankfully most people just kind of get on with it in terms of their religious practices. And so now, Daniela, you're a lawyer by training. Would you say there's a distinction between freedom of religion and freedom of worship?
Well, David, actually, our Constitutional Court has said that religious freedom includes freedom of worship. So when the Court looked at the ambit of this right, as our country's highest court, it said that it's the right to entertain religious beliefs that you choose, the right to declare those beliefs openly and publicly and without fear of hindrance or reprisal, and the right to manifest religious beliefs by worship, practice, teaching, or dissemination. And they also pointed out that freedom implies an absence of coercion or restraint, so that your freedom of religion will be limited when you are forced to act contrary to your religious beliefs, or you're hindered from acting in line with your beliefs. And I think what's important to point out is that in South Africa, our right to religious freedom actually goes much further even than the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, because we refer to it as the right to religious freedom. But what Section 15 of our Constitution protects is everyone's right to freedom of conscience. So, for example, to act in line with your conscience and not to violate it. Religion, thought, belief, and opinion. So it's actually a very, very wide right. And this is why it's important. Often when people think of religious freedom, they only think of, oh, it's important for religious people or South Africa's religious communities, of which there are many. But this is fundamentally a freedom issue of whether you as an individual have freedom to think and act in line with what you believe, whatever belief system that is.
Right, and Daniela, just staying with you, because you're the only lawyer in the room. Although, Michael, didn't you study law as well?
I did indeed, yes, but so long ago. Although I must say I'm fairly familiar with the religious freedom laws, having now been involved in this field for about 7 years. So,
okay,
not
well,
qualified, but able to give an opinion. But Daniela's the expert.
Okay, well, Daniela, let's stick with you then, because in Section 15, Section 15.2, religious observances may be conducted at state or state-aided institutions, provided that these observances follow rules made by the appropriate public authorities, are conducted on an equitable basis, attendance at them is free and voluntary. I think that speaks to also the importance of the division between church and state. And why is that an important feature of a religiously free society?
So, David, I think that is a wonderful section to start off with, because it differentiates, for example, from America, which is strictly secular, where there's no religion allowed in public schools, for example. And what Section 15.2 allows, and it was the subject of a case called the Oh God case, which was an atheist organization that took public schools to court for having a Christian ethos and belief system and so forth. And what the court found in that case, which for SA, I think we assisted one of the parties, we weren't actually involved, but we assisted one of the parties, is that we're not a secular society. And in our society, because we're so diverse, we celebrate diversity. And religious freedom, as with all your human rights, David, it is not a right that you leave behind when you close your front door in the morning. You don't leave your right to life. Okay, well, maybe in Joburg you do. Your right to dignity, your right to equality, and not to be unfairly discriminated against. You leave none of those rights behind when you close your front door in the morning. And suddenly, you take your right to religious freedom with you wherever you go. It attaches to you as a human being, which is why it's called a human right. So what the court decided in that matter, in line of Section 15.2, is that public schools, they're community assets. So everyone in the community needs to feel free to go to that school and be able to express their faith. So if you're a community and you have 20% Hindu, 15% Jewish, 10% Muslim, some Christian, some atheist, some agnostic, all together in the community, everyone needs to feel free in that school to be able to live out their faith. So obviously parents get elected to the school governing body. I think it's every 3 or 4 years. So they represent the parents who have their children enrolled at that school, then some of the learners also on the governing body, and some of the school management team, such as some of the teachers and the principal and so forth. And they need to decide in that context for that specific school what religious observances rules they will put in place and what that would look like. So it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets 5 minutes in the school assembly. It can mean that. It doesn't have to mean that. As long as it's equitable, which means that even-handed consideration and respect is extended to everyone. It's free and voluntary, so no one is forced to participate in prayer meetings they don't want to participate in. I mean, throwback to Christian education in South Africa, basically, that I think some of us would have been exposed to, where you were subjected to school prayers whether you wanted to or not, and that was part of just being in a public school. So freely and voluntary, according to the rules set out by the governing body, which of course, even as the school demographic changes, that religious policy might have to be reviewed and updated. And takes place on an equitable basis. So it's wonderful, the fact that in South Africa, we get to take our religious freedom with us in public, and it's not something that we leave behind.
So, Michael, many years ago, I went to go and visit Istanbul in Turkey, and I paid a visit to the Hagia Sophia, which was this grand old cathedral from the Byzantine era, which was then subsequently sacked in, I think, the 1400s and became a cathedral, I beg your pardon, became a mosque. And then under Ataturk in the 20th century, became a kind of a secular state symbol or a kind of national museum. Now it's being kind of pulled back. They're trying to make it a mosque again. And I think that that's an interesting example of this kind of tension between secularism and religion as well. I mean, the way I also see secular system is that it's kind of the state system is neutral, and then, you know, religious organizations, different persuasions should be allowed to flourish. Whereas in France, for example, you're actually prohibited in public schools from wearing religious insignia on your, if you're a schoolgirl, wearing a crucifix around your neck is prohibited. So it seems to me that there's a bit of a tension there between, like, what is the appropriate point at which secularism and religion meet?
Well, I think the role of the state should be, and particularly in this country, within the ambit of our constitution, the role of the state should be to actually facilitate the maximum enjoyment of the freedoms that the Constitution grants us, and particularly freedom of religion in this instance. And so therefore, you're absolutely right. I think the big danger, of course, comes when any state decides to intervene and to try to in some way regulate religious freedom. Because as long as people are expressing themselves in a way that is lawful, there should be no restriction on that type of expression. I mean, you should be allowed to, and you are in this country, allowed to express your freedom of religion, even as the Constitutional Court pointed out, if that belief is bizarre, irrational, illogical, incapable of any proof, it's still protected by your right to religious freedom. And so therefore, yes, we ought to be enjoying that. In fact, the Constitutional Court has said that it should be a very important way of us expressing our diversity, celebrating our diversity, of the wonderful kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith society that South Africa is. And it's interesting you should mention the issue of the religious garb in France, for example. In this country, we've had a very important case, which was called the Pelé case, where a young girl who had gone through a coming of age type ceremony in the Hindu faith had a small stud in her nose, I think it was, which celebrated or commemorated that moment in her life. And she went to school. It was a public school, not a private school. There's obviously an important distinction between those two. And she was told, this is against our jewelry policy, take it out. And she obviously said, no, this is actually part of my faith. It's an expression of my faith. And I think the Constitutional Court rightly agreed with her that it isn't something that should be blanket banned. We must, in the public context particularly, reasonably accommodate one another. And even if you have things that are in kind of like tension, as you say, with each other, the role of the state particularly should be to always facilitate the maximum enjoyment and the benefit of the human rights that we have been given under our Constitution.
Right. So, Daniela, I mean, Michael drew this distinction between public and private schools. And I think it is an important feature of a diverse, plural society that you can have institutions that can be the repository for cultural practices, for a particular view of the world, particular set of ideas or spiritual beliefs, as the case may be. Why is it important to make that distinction? And are we giving enough space to private institutions, private educational institutions to provide that space for learners?
So, David, actually, you have the right to form private religious schools and other private religious associations that you want. And freedom of association in our country, as Michael said, the state needs to protect and promote all the rights in the Bill of Rights. And so much of it is based on freedom and facilitating maximum freedom in the public space. Now, the distinction between public schools and private schools. So, as I said earlier, public schools are community assets. So they belong to the community. Now, private schools, and especially private religious schools, are founded by specific members of a religious community. They're founded on a specific religious ethos, specific religious values, and so forth. And they have the freedom to require that people who voluntarily associate with them adhere to their rules and beliefs. So, for example, there's a High Court case from many years ago with the German school in Pretoria, case of Wittmann. And this German girl enrolled at the school, and she didn't want to take part in the religious instruction classes. Now, religious instruction classes are where you're taught about a specific faith with the view of inculcating adherence to that faith. So think of, for example, Sunday school. That would be a religious instruction class. But it was a part of the school's requirement and rules that you actually attend this class. And the court said that actually when she voluntarily enrolled, she agreed to adhere to those rules. Like, this wasn't a public school, this was a private school, it was a private association. She yielded basically when she chose to enroll there, to limit herself and follow its rules. And I think that's an important distinction, is that, you know, when, let's say, you start a vegetarian society and they meet every Tuesday, and now I want to come to your Tuesday meetings, but I want to bring my steak. You can say, okay, well, you're welcome to come, but here at this society on Tuesdays, we only eat apples and anything else that's vegetarian. You must leave your steak at the door if you want to come. And you should have the right to do that. I shouldn't be able to force you to have to change your core values and reason for existence to accommodate me.
And to what extent is it reasonable to flip that around and to say, okay, well, we're a non-religious school, that if you come with your religious insignia or your jewelry, whatever the case may be, that is not allowed here. You spoke, Michael, earlier of this reasonableness test. Do you think that a secular institution would be similarly justified in prohibiting religious expression at their school?
I think if it's specifically set up to do that, because don't forget, religious freedom rights is your right not only to believe a specific faith, but also to have no faith at all. And so if a school was established specifically to promote, as part of its ethos and its culture, secular values that were non-religious, even, you know, to the extent that it would not tolerate any form of religious expression, as long as all the parents who join the school understand that, and all the teachers who join the school understand that, and everybody agrees to that ethos, then yes, it is in that sense a balanced scale. It's the correct application. I think, as Daniela correctly said, the problems sometimes arise when people have gone and joined some form of, whether it's a private Christian school or whatever it is, and then having come into that ethos, they then decide that they're actually not happy with things that are taught or done, and now they want to change the rules from the inside. That is problematic, because of course, as soon as you start to have those rights trumping the ethos of the school, which is obviously held by the vast majority of people you would imagine in the school, then it pretty much negates the freedom of association rights that a school, if it's a faith-based school, for example, would typically and should typically enjoy.
Right. Well, Daniela, I'm curious about the definitional side of this conversation. So what actually counts as a religion? I mean, I know that there are some people who believe in, I don't know, Star Wars is a kind of a religious ecosystem, or some people associate themselves as being Klingons from Star Trek. There's some people who would call themselves Satanists, for example. At what point can we say that this is a religion and this isn't?
So I think, David, the correct way of looking at that is that Section 15 is aimed to ensure that everyone is free to adhere to their deeply held values and beliefs. Now, whether they would even view those values and beliefs as religious themselves doesn't matter. And whether it's a system of beliefs that, you know, it's their own personal code of morality that they live with, and it's, you know, doesn't come from a specific religious system, or if it's a secular worldview, that is what Section 15 protects. It's your ability to live in line with your beliefs, whether you yourself would even classify them as religious or not. It's the ability to live in line with them, not be forced to act against them, take them with you in public and express them publicly. Even, you know, if people with different thoughts and opinions disagree with yours, you have the right to express those publicly. And I mean, our Constitutional Court has said that religious freedom, rightly, is the hallmark of a democracy. And it's one of the key cornerstones of a democracy, because if you take that freedom away and people aren't able to live in line with their own value systems in public, then you don't have much freedom at all, and you don't really have a democracy to call as such. And yeah, I think that the court has also rightly said that the objective of our constitution is to allow different concepts about the human nature and the nature of human existence to inhabit the public realm. So we all need to make space for one another and tolerate one another in this diverse society that we have. And part of that is that the right to religious freedom extends as much to the secularist, the atheist, the agnostic, the Hindu, the Christian, the Jew, the Muslim, and all the other beliefs and opinions in between that you can think of.
Yeah, I'm not a religious person myself, but I certainly recognize the importance of religious freedom as I guess a bellwether for freedom in general in a society. All right, so Michael, let's turn now to 4SA itself. Could you tell our audience more about the nature of your organization, your objectives, and how you go about executing your work?
The most important thing about freedom of religion and the work that we do is that we as an organization are faith neutral. Religious freedom is really a broad right. It covers everybody's beliefs, whatever you may choose to believe, even if you have no belief at all. And that also means that we are doctrinally neutral. We don't pick any particular interpretation of any belief and think that one thing is better or more favorable than another. As long as what you do is legal and lawful, then you are, under the Constitution, allowed to express your religious freedom. And that's the religious freedom right that 4SA protects and promotes. We're also, of course, politically neutral, and we work with anybody and everybody in the political realm who will uphold and protect and promote religious freedom. So we're broad-based in that respect. We were actually established, interestingly enough, because the South African Human Rights Commission were contacted by an atheist couple in a local neighborhood of a local church who got onto the church's website, downloaded a parenting manual, looked at it, picked out some area of teaching on the discipline of children, particularly that they didn't like, and got the Human Rights Commission to essentially bring an action against the church and told them specifically that they must now remove those scriptures from their teaching and they must send their pastors for sensitization training, which obviously is not just a question of should you or should you not discipline your child or how you should do that, but very much a religious freedom issue. Because if the state can tell you what you can and cannot teach on or preach on, and you can be forced to send your religious leaders for some sensitization training applied by the state or whoever the state designate, that is the antithesis of religious freedom. And so really 4SA was originally formed as a response to that. But very quickly, it became apparent that religious freedom, as I said at the beginning, is a right that unless we protect it, unless we are vigilant over it, it can very quickly be eroded. And I think that what we're seeing perhaps in the global context is an erosion of religious freedom, particularly when religious freedom in the traditional sense comes into conflict with perhaps the more secular ideology, which is in itself a type of worldview or religion. And as Daniela said, freedom of religion is beyond just a particular faith. It includes, your conscience, your beliefs, your opinions, your views, and everything that goes with that. And it is, in that sense, a basket of human rights, speech and association and assembly as well. And so, we then found that there were other issues that we were facing. So, for example, one of them was an attempt which we contested and sometimes still have to contest, for the state to regulate religion, to set up some form of peer review mechanism whereby it could decide, who is acceptable as a religious practitioner. And of course, as soon as you do that, even if you're looking at people's practices in the faith context, they're always going to be based on some form of a doctrine. And who should therefore decide what's valid and what's not? So we were very much engaged in that debate. You could even have called it a battle, because it was in Parliament for, I think, a total of 5 days in the end, and it was a very contentious issue. But again, our view is that as long as you are doing something in terms of your faith that is lawful, then you should be entitled under law to express it, and the state really has no business in intervening. So that was kind of how 4SA began. It was, in one sense, as a response, as a reaction. But on the other hand, I think we very quickly realized that this is an ongoing issue, and it comes in multiple forms. We've talked about the schools issue. We're currently looking at the hate speech context, for example, where potentially criminalizing hate speech for up to 3 years in jail, or 5 years for a second offense. That's a very serious issue. And we have fought very hard for a robust protection clause to be put in for bona fide, legitimate, in other words, religious freedom of speech. That obviously does not amount to an advocacy to hatred or incitement to do harm, but that should be in very clearly fair and square. Because again, in other countries around the world, you've seen, for example, pastors arrested simply for quoting scriptures in public because that was going to cause a breach of the peace. That was considered to be hate speech in the UK recently. Finnish MP also up on a charge of hate speech for tweeting scriptures. These are things that can very quickly devolve or digress, if you like, or deteriorate unless we watch them closely. So that's what we do. We are, in that sense, watchmen. We evaluate policies, we evaluate legislation, we evaluate court cases that might be pending or we might become aware of, to make sure that wherever possible, we intervene to ensure that religious freedom and its related rights are protected and upheld.
Well, so Daniela, let's turn to you. We're recording on the 14th of September, and I'd like to pick up on this issue of the hate speech bill. The comment period for public consultation, that's now closed, but the bill is still before Parliament. What are some of the risks that you've identified with the bill, and what efforts are 4SA doing to raise awareness around some of these potential problems?
I think the starting point is perhaps to consider that we haven't been a democracy for that long. We've been a democracy for less than 30 years in this country. And we come out of an era of apartheid where speech and expression were heavily censored and people were sent to jail by the state for undesirable speech. And there are numerous cases of people really fighting for this right. And it was only in 1993 with our interim constitution that it actually became entrenched in a Bill of Rights. And people could rely on, okay, I am allowed to say stuff and the state can't send me to jail for it if the state doesn't like it. Now, less than 30 years later, we seem to be back at the very same situation we found ourselves in before democracy, with a bill that wants to criminalize speech. And for the first offense of hate speech, you will go to jail for 3 years. For a second offense of hate speech, you will go to jail for 5 years. Now, perhaps to explain freedom of expression, the right to freedom of expression extends to offensive beliefs, opinions, politically incorrect thoughts and opinions that you want to express publicly. And the Constitution only limits that protection on 3 grounds. 1, the propaganda for war. Propaganda for war is not protected speech in this country, so the state can pass laws to limit it. The incitement of imminent violence, and imminent violence there being the key concept, because in the case of Moyo, the Concord said that, the Intimidation Act was too wide because it only actually required what would come down to incitement of violence. It didn't have to be imminent. So it actually unjustifiably limited free expression that was protected by the Constitution. Because, for example, the court said there that if you were to go around in affluent suburb and start handing out flyers advocating for expropriation without compensation, that, for example, would be limited under the Intimidation Act, but it's something that our Constitution sees as protected. And then the third ground for speech that isn't protected is the advocacy of hatred based on race, ethnicity, gender, or religion, with the incitement to cause harm. Now, this is commonly known as hate speech. And what this bill seeks to do is to criminalize that. And people might go like, okay, but what's the problem with that? So I think the first problem with that is that in this country, we already have the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, known as PEPUDO, the Equality Act, and that's a civil law. So we already have a remedy for hate speech that has seen quite a few hate speech cases where people were fined, they were ordered to apologize, and so forth. Quite a few cases, such as Bongani Masuku and John Welani, were decided under the Equality Act. And recently last year in the Kwelani case, the Concord looked at the hate speech definition in the Equality Act, which at that point, as Michael often points out, had been in effect for 21 years, and said, hang on, this definition is way too wide. This definition actually limits constitutionally protected speech. We need to narrow this definition down. And the court significantly narrowed that definition down. But what this bill does is it takes that Equality Act definition for hate speech, expands it, and then criminalizes it. So once again, we're back into this position where we're going to criminalize speech that the Constitution sees protected. And not only that, this results in a very topsy-turvy situation in law where you've got a lower standard you need to meet in criminal law than in civil law. It's going to be harder for someone to prove that someone should apologize to them under the Equality Act than it is going to be for the state to prove that they should go to jail. And as a result of that, we may very well see a situation where offensive ideologies, beliefs, thoughts, or views are stifled in public. And I mean, as someone who has a regular podcast show, I would be worried about that and how that would affect me, because how often what comes out of one's mouth is even offensive to yourself. And you're like, whoa, maybe I should backtrack on that. And for example, I mean, this bill, whereas under the Popular, you have to prove deep and emotional psychological harm in order to meet the first element of hate speech. Under this bill, any emotional, psychological, physical, social, cultural, or economic harm goes. So what's any emotional harm? That would include offensive. What is cultural and social harm? I mean, as a lawyer, I can't tell you what that means. That's a very vague term. Does that mean for private associations that they now need to accept everyone and say they accept everyone? What is the repercussions of this? What is cultural harm? So it's a very, very problematic bill in a democracy where we've only recently acquired the right to freedom of expression. And it's very problematic because you're going to go to jail easier than be ordered to apologize.
And Michael, do you have anything to add there?
I think that one of the biggest challenges of criminalizing speech is that just the fact that it's criminalized is a chilling effect on freedom of speech, because, and particularly as Daniela said, the definitions of hate speech under this particular bill are very loose in the juice. They're very undefined. And you don't want a situation whereby people are just inhibited from perhaps expressing their viewpoints. Look, the other thing I think to say is this, that I think the motivation for this, at least certainly what's been stated in public, is that it's coming against racism, against racist speech. But we have already seen, I believe, how effectively the common law crime of crimen injuria has been used to basically address those who have used racist speech. Penny Mombo, Vicky Sparrow being two pretty high-profile examples. And so I think the question is, why do we even need this new law on the statute books? We certainly believe that it shouldn't be there. And what we've been fighting for particularly is to have a very robust clause which protects bona fide religious freedom speech. The one that's in there at the moment, which was the source of an awareness campaign that we ran, was because the Deputy Minister, John Jeffrey, said that he felt that it would cover perhaps something that a pastor would say from the pulpit. But if you, as an individual, express that in some other context, say you put it up on your social media, then it wouldn't protect you. And that's very concerning. And we put forward amendments, as we do, substantive amendments. We put a 43-page submission in. We argued it before Parliament. 103,000 individual submissions were made to Parliament in the last round of public comment through the DRSA public participation online platform. And when it came back to Parliament last week, it was uncovered that, lo and behold, they hadn't even considered them. And there were certainly no changes made. And so therefore, yes, we are concerned about this. We're concerned about the process of it, and we're concerned, in fact, about the need for it at all.
Yeah, and the IRR submissions as well were also disregarded. So do you think that, is that going to go back and some of those submissions taken into account, or are they full steam ahead?
Yes. No, that was what was decided. And again, members of the committee pointed that out, and the agreement of the committee was that the Department of Justice now has to go back, review their analysis of the submissions that were made. They said that there was some breakdown of communication. They acknowledged that, and they're going to then revert, hopefully, with those submissions properly taken into account. But again, this thing, but for I think perhaps even for SA's observation, you ask what role we play, the fact that we were able to recognize that these submissions had been left out and to point that out. Otherwise, who knows? This could have just simply flowed through, and lo and behold, you're then left with a law on the statute books, which once enforced is enforceable. And that is obviously very concerning. And to reverse something once it's passed into law, as I'm sure you're aware, is extremely difficult, time-consuming, and very, very expensive.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a bit of a public relations exercise happening here, because in many ways it's very difficult to argue against hate speech. Nobody wants to be for hate speech. But I think it's very important to root any limitations on that freedom of expression within the Constitution.
So just to tag on what you were saying there, I think the correct view of this is actually that one is for freedom of expression, you're for democracy, you're for freedom, and you're against state censorship and penalization of potentially offensive speech.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of expressing it. So what else has been on your agenda? I know that you've also been pretty active during the COVID lockdown. There were some quite strong infringements on people's civil liberties during the lockdown. But it didn't seem to me that there were any religious restrictions apart from on gatherings at religious institutions. Did 4SA play a role in pushing back against that?
No, absolutely we did. And, effectively, all our constitutional rights were taken away. You might remember we were all under house arrest for some weeks as a consequence of that. And again, not to say that government hasn't got the right to take whatever steps it needs to or believes that it needs to under a given emergency situation, particularly at the beginning. But what we really were concerned about was the disparity, as we saw it, the unfair discrimination between how certain sectors of societies were treated versus how the religious communities were treated. At one point, for example, you were not allowed to have any form of religious gathering. That meant literally two people praying together were prohibited and potentially sanctioned by up to 6 months in jail. And yet at the same time, you could sit side by side at a slot machine in a casino and gamble the night away. The only problem you would have is if your losses became so great that you decided to pray together to ask for some favor, at which point you could have been arrested. There was the absurdity of it. And so we contested that actually, because this was unfair, government was unfairly discriminating and therefore acting illegally and encroaching upon religious freedom rights unlawfully. And the fact that they then amended their regulations to bring that balance back before it actually went to court, literally on the steps of the courtroom, was an indication that they at least recognized that that was the case and that they were in fact in the wrong.
And Daniela, what else is on 4SA's radar in terms of public advocacy?
Well, at present, I would say it's raising awareness about the new forms of publications regulations that were just passed. 4SA has been engaging with the FPB and the department since when they first started considering amending the Act to bring it in line with our digital era. So those regulations, we're pleased to say, are quite balanced and have come out. On further that, the Department of Home Affairs also has their single marriage statute that they're working towards. So they've just rolled out their single marriage policy, which sets out the state's, the framework and the positions the state is going to take on various things. And again, we're very pleased to say that the advocacy and public participation and lobbying has cooled off, and the resulting policy has very well balanced everyone's rights the way it should be in a pluralistic, diverse democracy. So everyone's reasonably accommodated and can't complain.
Could you go into a bit more detail about that Marriage Act and what issues you flagged there and how you push back?
In South Africa, we don't have a single law that regulates marriages. We've got a variety of different laws that apply to different unions, and it's quite messy. And as a result, quite a few unions aren't regulated at all. So for example, your unions concluded according to Islamic rights, Hindu rights, and Jewish rights are, for example, unregulated. On top of that, there was also some problems in the customary marriage realm that needed to be regulated to better protect women and children. So what the state has done is look at, okay, how can we actually take all of these bits of different pieces of legislation together, come up with one law that regulates all the marriages in South Africa, and to make sure that we don't find ourselves as a government in trouble again with the courts, because the state has been whacked over the hand by the courts quite a few times for not sufficiently protecting vulnerable members of societies, women and children, for example, when a marriage is dissolved either by divorce or death. But the marriage wasn't legally recognized, so they've got no remedies to enforce rights. So our concern mainly was with the proposed single marriage statute, that it would violate religious freedom and freedom of association. In terms of, you look at certain religions, they often have very certain requirements about what is a marriage and what isn't a marriage. And you have religious institutions who are founded on these doctrines, and they have religious officials who sometimes are also marriage officers, not state marriage officers, but so for example, pastors, imams, and who have marriage licenses to conclude marriages. And for example, our concern would be that, let's say, a Roman Catholic priest who doesn't believe that if you're divorced, you can get married again, would be forced to marry an excommunicated church member who was excommunicated on grounds of divorce. Or, for example, that someone who wanted to conclude their marriage according to Hindu rites could force a Muslim imam to do the solemnization ceremony for them. So what we said to the state was that, look, it's wonderful. It would be wonderful if all the laws were in one place. And of course, everyone needs to be protected. No one wants anyone left out in the cold and vulnerable. But we need to make sure we do that in a way that accommodates for our diversity, because you can't use a cookie cutter approach in this area, because marriage is so often very closely linked to religious beliefs. And the resulting policy that came out is very balanced in that, for example, the state identified that actually we need to expand who can be a marriage officer. So not just the state officials who are employed as marriage officers at Home Affairs who have to marry everyone, and not just religious marriage officers such as pastors and imams and priests and so forth, but let's actually expand it to all stakeholders and members in society, all societal groups. So everyone from every group can become a marriage officer, conclude marriages according to the rights and tenets and beliefs of that group. And that is very, very balanced, because no one's going to be forced to take part in the solemnities, the solemnization, the religious and cultural aspects of a marriage ceremony that goes contrary to their own beliefs and tenets. And similarly, something that we are quite happy about, and which we did ask the state for when we met with them, was that, hang on, why are civil marriage officers, your Home Affairs employees, why aren't they bothered with the solemnities, the religious and cultural aspects of a marriage? Shouldn't they just be worried about whether the parties are free to marry and whether there's any legal impediment and with registering the marriage? And shouldn't the state be neutral in that realm? Shouldn't they just do the checklist and make sure that everything is met and the marriage is registered? So why are we requiring civil officials to take part in the solemnities? Rather just split it and make it a pure administrative function. And that's also a position that the policy proposes. Michael, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it was a good, as you say, good balanced policy, because what it did, which is again what we felt it should do, is to separate let's say, the religious ceremonial side of the marriage, which is important to many people, obviously, to be expressed in many different ways, from what the state requires in terms of the legalities, because obviously futuristically there's children involved, there's property involved, there are inheritances involved, and so on. And so they did, we believe, make a very good division after a lot of consultation. The biggest concern we had, of course, which was certainly something which potentially could have come out of this, and why we were so engaged with it, was that at one stage there was the suggestion that perhaps all marriage officers, whether you were religious or not, could be obligated to perform all marriages. And of course, that was very concerning for the faith community. And I think at the end of the day, common sense probably prevails. Of the 16,500 marriage officers that we have in the country, over 15,000 are from faith communities. And so the danger to the state was that those marriage licenses from those officers would just be handed back. In other states, they have to pick up a massive bureaucratic problem. And so I think at the end of the day, apart from anything else, common sense prevailed. But we were happy with the outcome.
All right. And Daniela, I mean, what we've been talking about has been just one example of a civil society actor advancing a particular cause. And that's really an essential component of democracy. Democracy is not just about elections, but it's also about civil society making its voice heard. How optimistic are you about the state of our civil society at the moment and the ability to advance change?
Dave, I am quite optimistic because I think more and more South Africans are waking up to the fact that, one, I have the ability to comment on laws. That's actually part of my democratic rights in this society. And I think, under the apartheid state and until now, democracy, most South Africans weren't aware that they had this right. It's not something that we learned in life skills and life orientation in school. I'm always a big proponent of this is the type of thing one should learn in those subjects, including like how to do a tax return. These would all be wonderful skills. But I think more and more South Africans are waking up to the fact through, for example, the work that 4SA and other institutions like yourselves do, that actually these are laws that are being proposed. Parliament is asking for comment. They're asking for my comment. I can say something on this. I can say if I disagree. And Parliament actually needs to listen to me. Wow, that's amazing. So I think people are waking up to that and more people are participating. Also, we've seen with the establishment of platforms like DRSA, just how easy it has become for the public to comment. And as Michael pointed out earlier, how wonderful it is that some of the Parliament members are very astute and pick up when public submissions haven't been properly considered. Because actually our Constitutional Court has said that Parliament needs to engage with the public on things in a meaningful way. Public participation needs to be meaningful. It can't just be a checklist of things to tick off. You actually need to show that you consider the substance of what the public said when you were making a law. Otherwise, you can challenge that law later. So I think with the growing appetite and awareness, I am very optimistic. Michael?
One of the roles that 4SA certainly tries to play when it comes specifically to religious freedom issues is also to educate people, to give people a balanced view of the situations that we believe could potentially detrimentally affect religious freedom. That's specifically where we are focused, of course. And then to give them the opportunity of actually making their voices heard. And I think that is such an important part. As I said at the beginning of the conversation, religious freedom is really a foundation stone of any democracy worthy of the name, because it is so broadly encompassing of what we would see as foundational human rights. And therefore, to make sure that we make our voices heard while we have the opportunity, and certainly while there is an openness, which there is in this country, to be able to do that, to exercise that right, and to have that right heard. So while we still have the opportunity, then let's make our voices heard, let's speak up, because we can potentially make a better society as a consequence, even if the conversation does from time to time become pretty robust.
Oh, yeah. And I think we all have an interest in this. As David Foster Wallace once wrote, everybody worships. And I think whether you're an atheist or a religious person, I think all civic-minded South Africans should have an interest in preserving religious freedom. But Daniela, I'll give you the last word. Anybody who's interested in supporting your cause and getting involved with your work, how might they go about doing so? And what other resources could they draw on to better inform themselves about religious freedom in South Africa?
So Dave, the best place will always be our website, which is www.forsa.org.za, where we post articles, videos, and we also alert the public when things are happening and they can participate. And on our website, they can also sign up for a newsletter, which we promise not to spam people and which we will only send out once a quarter. But if you sign up for a newsletter, this also means that we'll alert you and send you a special alert if something such as the hate speech bill, for example, pops open again for public comment. Other than on our website, they can follow us on Facebook at Freedom of Religion SA, where we also make sure to post daily.
Right. And very important for your cause, obviously, is financial support as well. And the Egyptians have a saying, which is trust in God, but tie your camel to a post. So you shouldn't leave anything up to chance. If you want to support this cause, there are various financial means in which you can aid 4SA. Is that correct?
Yeah, again, on our website, which is the forsa.org.za, you have a donate button. And we are entirely dependent upon voluntary contributions. That literally is how we exist. We don't have sponsors. We don't have big funding behind us. And much of our contributions comes from individuals. So whether it's a small amount or a large amount, that is what will keep us in the game. Wherever you're going to find religious freedom rights in danger, you're going to find us in the front lines of faith and freedom. So if that's something that's important to you, please then consider supporting us financially so that we can keep doing it.
Well, Michael Swain, Daniela Ellerbeck, thank you very much for joining me on the Solutions podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have been with you. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thanks for having us, Dave. It's a real privilege.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Also, leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. What does religious freedom mean to you? How important is religious freedom in a democratic society? Also, if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well. My name is David Ansara. Until next week, take care.